Dakota. I'll get it. I'm sorry. I'll get there.
Oh, right here. You said Trey?
Jake. Alright. Guys, you're not being in the bar. Shut the door, big man.
William.
Nathan. Carla. Kenya. Raul. Alex. Jonathan. Ashley. Katie. Jacob. You're not in this class, you were dropped.
Oh, really?
Yes. I know you checked the new schedule, right? And I know you know that your exam is now on the 17th of September. Yes, Mr. Simon.
I want you to also know that I tried to print the paper again, it didn't work.
I've heard that. What I would say right now is ditch the library and try the UCC. And if you can't print in there, then as students, you need to start complaining to the administration. Because trust me, the hole was there 2 weeks before finals, and that's their attempt at fixing it. So there's no point in me saying anything, right? So that I don't know what else to suggest, because it's not acceptable that you can't print work for your faculty members. And I think that you need to see, is it just a library issue, or is it the entire student computer network on campus? So I would say go and try the UCC and see if you can print out there. And if you can't, you guys need to start making some noise.
Yeah, I'm doubtful.
You're doubtful?
I'm doubtful.
Make noise. Complain. You paid to be here, to have access to this stuff. Right? So, alright, those of you walking in late need to check with me, because I don't have you down on the register, and I will be reporting you as stopped attending. Okay, quick look at some background in motor behavior and some of the ideas around the theories that we're using to give us the information to show that we're developmentally appropriate. So that's key all the time, that we're trying to be as developmentally appropriate as possible. Okay. So one of the things we're looking at, okay, here's a newborn. Newborn, there's the tag. Right? Newborn. So a family member has a baby, you go to the hospital to see the baby, and that's what you get. Okay? So what can this baby do? Okay. Does it move? Well, we see movement, right? Legs wiggle, arms jiggle. But it can't move voluntarily that week it's born. So the movement you see is not something it has control over. Right? So there's this very helpless mass of cells that's suddenly appeared. It's been in this nice, warm, gooey environment, and now all of a sudden it's out in the cold, on hard surfaces, having to deal with gravity. Gravity is an environmental constraint. So when it's in the womb, gravity doesn't have a lot of effect, because it's basically in water. Now it's out here and it tries to move a leg. And all of a sudden it's much, much harder because there's another force pulling on it. So you don't live near your family member, you go away, and about 9 months later you go to visit and catch up. And you walk in the house and you're faced with this. Doesn't look anything like this, right? So a massive amount of change in 9 months. And now, what do you see this child do? It can sit up. It can reach out and pick up a toy, right? Maybe self-locomoting. So it could be scooting around on its bottom, it could be dragging itself around on its tummy, right? Might be creeping on hands and knees. It can move around and go where it wants to go. Okay? Totally different individual to what you saw the first time. Okay? So, what we want to know is, how did that happen? Like, how did those skills appear? What's going on in the brain? What's going on with behaviors for that change to occur? Right? And then think, what would you see in another 9 months? You go away, and 9 months later, you come back and visit. So now this child is 18 months old. What are you going to see the child do at 18 months old? Walk. Okay. Possibly starting to run. Talking. Okay. So in 18 months, we've gone from a helpless, unable to move, unable to talk, can't see very well, to a crazy person that's all over the place, and you've got to have eyes in the back of your head to keep track of what they're up to. Right? So what we want to do is understand that process. How did that happen? And when we are trying to understand something, we often use a theory or a model. I mentioned that the other day. All right? And in motor development, the major theories across the history have been maturational theory, information processing theory, and now ecological theory. So very, very briefly, what do those mean? All right, so the maturational theory, quite old, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, even into the 50s and 60s. Right? And at that point, what people who were studying what we now call motor development, although it wasn't called that at the time, what they believed was that motor development is really genetic. Right? It's driven by your genetics and your hereditary, and that as you mature, particularly as your central nervous system matures, you do these movements that you see. Right? So they were looking really at a nature argument. Movement is nature-driven. Right? They didn't think that the environment really had very much to do with what you saw a child perform. Right? All children stand up and walk, all children run, all children will throw if you give them a ball. And so it wasn't really the environment, it was all about at what point was their nervous system prepared and ready to do the next skill. Okay? And they spent a lot of time looking at the characteristics of these skills and giving very detailed qualitative descriptions of what was happening. So that was great because a lot of the information we still use is based on the descriptions weren't wrong, right? I mean, they were watching children and describing what they saw children do. The descriptions were very accurate. The reasoning behind why they thought they saw what they saw was a little, now we know, a little dodgy, right? So we got a lot of very good information from this. But they, as I said, they really didn't see any idea about this interaction that we talked about. What day is today? Tuesday, last Thursday. Okay? So any influence the environment had would have just maybe possibly slowed the child down. It wouldn't have actually changed anything. So they did a lot of work, but unfortunately some of the ideas that we have, some of the concepts for PE teachers over the years and for parents that were driven by this old information, things like basic motor skills, emerge automatically. Well, that's not entirely true. Some of them do. Some of them are hardwired, what we call hardwired. Right? Children do walk. And if they are typically developing, the walking will emerge at around 12 months. Right? But throwing, catching, hopping, skipping, jumping up do not emerge automatically. If we don't provide the opportunity, if we don't give teaching, if we don't provide space, that skill doesn't happen. Right? You think back to our MSU chart, stage 5 of throwing doesn't emerge automatically. Right? Because it takes practice. It didn't just occur. Also the idea then that if they just emerge automatically, then I don't need to do anything. The parent, the teacher, I don't have to do anything to get them ready to do these skills. It's just going to happen. All I have to do is put the ball down on the floor and walk away, and they're going to throw and catch and kick, and all these things are just going to, when they're ready, they'll just do it. Right? So, we've already looked at information that suggests that that's not true. So we moved on. In the 70s, we started doing and seeing a lot of research from what we call an information processing perspective. So I was in school, I was in undergrad in the early 80s, and this was all we did, information processing. It's a load of fun, actually. I loved it. We had a lot of fun with it. But it was, we'd already gone through with past maturational theory, and we were strongly entrenched in information processing and schema theory. Right? So initially, because motor development didn't really exist, information processing was a motor learning theory. We used information processing to look at how does the brain learn and change skills. We weren't really using information processing to explain the behavior we were seeing. We were looking at it as a learning tool. Okay? But now, we can use it as a motor development tool as well. And if we're coming from this perspective, we say, you know what, nature doesn't drive everything. Nurture might be more important. So for a long, long time, you might have heard the idea of a nature versus nurture argument. For a long, long time in education, that argument went on between two groups of people that were on completely opposite sides of the fence. Do we learn, do we do things automatically, or do we have to teach, nurture, facilitate? So, do I run fast, or can I be taught to run fast? Actually, now, nature, nurture, you can't go one side or the other. Right? Now, I'm much better at saying, you know what, it's both involved. So, information processing then says what I do is driven by something from outside. So very, very different from the maturation idea where they were saying what I do is all driven by what's going on in my body. So it was a complete change as a theory, which is why when I was in school we were learning it because everyone was so excited about it because it was a completely new idea. Right? And what they do in this theory is they say, okay, so your brain is like hardware. It's like a computer. Okay? The software are things like your attention span, your memories, your capability to use information, right? So I've got a computer-based model, and that I just move in response to something that happened outside me. Okay? So what we have, a very, very basic information processing model, is a 3-step model. And there are way more complicated models than this out there, but this is the easy, simple version, which is what we need for now. is sensory input. Okay? So, we go back to our computer idea. I have to input data into the computer. I have to put some information into the computer in order for anything to happen. Right? So, in human terms, I have to have sensory input. I have to see something, I have to hear something, I have to feel something in order to do something. Box 2 is my processing. So this is the computer doing all its jiggery, pokery, clever stuff that we don't get to see, right? This is my brain. My brain is processing that information that it received. And then we have motor output. Right? So I feed things into the computer does its magic, and a piece of paper pops out the other side with the answer on it. Right? For us, I put in sensory information, so that might be vision, seeing a ball. Right? Processing. Now this box is where all the complicated stuff happens. Highly, highly complicated, because processing involves lots of different functions. Right? First thing I have to do is recognize the sensory input, because I have to know it's a ball and I have to know which direction it's moving. Sometimes this can be a little tricky because it's abstract, because we all know what a ball is, and we're all quite good at discerning which direction it's moving in, right? So it seems a little bit of an odd idea, but we only know that because our brain can do that for us. So it has to recognize the input, then it has to decide what am I going to do with this? So I have to make a decision. Okay. So I recognize there's a ball flying towards me. Am I going to catch it? If I'm going to catch it, am I going to use two hands or one hand? If I'm going to use one hand, am I using my left hand or my right hand? Am I going to hit it with my chest? Am I going to nig it? Am I going to kick it? If I'm going to kick it, which foot am I going to kick it with? Am I going to kick it forwards, backwards, side? Lots of decisions, right? So this becomes highly complicated in here. Right? Having made the decision, it's going to pick the movement, right? And send the movement off to the muscles. So all of that is processing. The muscles get the signal from the brain, they get the instruction, and we see movement. Catch the ball, kick the ball. Right? Okay, so information processing is fascinating when you're reading research from information processing, because they're very much driven by this idea that what I do is driven by the information that I get. And when it first came out in the 70s and into the 80s, a lot of the research was on adults kind of your age, maybe a little bit younger, older teenagers, because they were trying to get a foundation, because you guys all move quite well, right? You don't have arthritis, you don't have, you understand what movement is. I'm not trying to explain what throwing a ball means. Okay? So the constraints are relatively easy to manage if I'm a researcher with you guys. Okay? I don't have a lot of problems. Okay? So this was the first time that we really looked at the process, what happens versus the product. Right? The maturational people looked at explaining what they were seeing. They looked at the product of the movement, not why the movement happened. Here was the first time they were trying to look at the why. What was going on? And part of the work that was being done from a research perspective that fits under information processing as an umbrella was some work looking at the link between perceptual and motor. Right? What's this link between what I perceive and what happens? And they were looking at trying to see whether if someone wasn't very good at this link, did that put them at more risk? Did that explain some learning disabilities that we saw in the classroom? So what they were trying to do was to develop perceptual motor movement programs that they could sell to schools or sell to parents that would help children who were struggling in the classroom if they got better at movement, ergo they would be better at maths. Right? It's not quite that straightforward, and they didn't work very well, and it eventually all kind of petered out. But again, a lot of the work that was done at that time we now use in a different way to explain this, what's happening developmentally between the perception of an object and the skill that we observe. Right? So, we move on, and reasonably recently we have moved into the ecological theories. Right? Initially, the first kind of dabbling was in the 80s, but I can tell you, because I was around, that that did not filter down into textbooks or research articles or knowledge in the field for quite some time. It was well into the 90s, really, before it started filtering down to us. Right? So, in the ecological perspective, then, we started trying to put everything that had come before together. If we're not just driven by genetics, if it's not maturation, and it's not completely what's happening in the environment, can we put this together to give us a stronger explanation of what's going on from a developmental perspective? And what we come up with, that's not good grammar. What we came up with was the model that we did on Thursday. Right? Our ecological, our constraints theory is an ecological theory. So, is the neural system important? Is the central nervous system important? Absolutely. But it doesn't work in isolation. It works in conjunction with the muscular system, the skeletal system, the family that you live in, right? The skill that I'm asking you to do. Everything now plays a role. at any one time, one system might be more important than some of the other systems. So if you're going to work with children around the age of puberty, the skeletal system becomes hugely important because they start out here and a year later they're here, right? So what happens to the skeletal system